What would you do if the people meant to protect you became your worst nightmare? Behind the gilded walls of their Beverly Hills mansion, Lyle and Eric Menendez lived a life of privilege, until the darkness inside their home drove them to kill. Were they cold-blooded murderers, or were they victims trying to escape years of unimaginable abuse? Would you be able to pull the trigger if it was the only way out? Unravel the chilling secrets behind the Menendez murders in this terrifying true crime tale. Chapter 1: The Beverly Hills Dream. In the golden glow of Beverly Hills, where the sun kissed the pristine lawns of sprawling mansions and Bentleys purred softly down tree-lined streets, the Menendez family seemed to epitomize the American dream. Behind the tall gates of their luxurious estate, Jose and Kitty Menendez had built a life of immense wealth and privilege, the kind that most could only dream of. But beneath the polished veneer of their glamorous existence, a darkness festered, a darkness that no amount of money could keep at bay. Jose Menendez was a man of towering ambition, his eyes always on the prize, a relentless force that powered his meteoric rise. Born into humble beginnings in Cuba, he had escaped the political turmoil of his homeland and found his way to the United States with nothing but a fierce determination to succeed. Jose's intellect was razor-sharp, his charisma undeniable, and his drive unmatched. It wasn't long before he carved out a path in the entertainment industry, clawing his way to the top as an executive for major companies like RCA and eventually Live Entertainment. His success was breathtaking, almost ruthless, as he accumulated millions, positioning himself as a titan in Hollywood's cutthroat world. With success came wealth, and with wealth came the trappings of power. The Menendez estate was a gleaming symbol of affluence, a vast mansion perched high in Beverly Hills, its manicured grounds stretching like an oasis in the urban jungle. Inside, everything was the picture of perfection, the finest furnishings, art that whispered of prestige, and walls that seemed to radiate the warmth of prosperity. To outsiders, the Menendez family appeared untouchable, insulated from the troubles of the world by their fortune. Kitty Menendez, Jose's wife, played her role as the perfect Hollywood wife with grace. A former beauty queen, she was delicate and glamorous, always well put together, her blonde hair falling in soft waves, her clothing tailored to perfection. Kitty had once harbored dreams of being a star, but those dreams had long since faded into the background, eclipsed by Jose's towering ambitions. She became the dutiful wife, the mother of two sons, Lyle and Eric, her own aspirations crumbling into the shadows of her husband's relentless pursuit of power. But within the Menendez household, not everything was as it seemed. The picture-perfect family hid cracks beneath its gleaming surface, cracks that grew wider with each passing year. Jose ruled his household with an iron fist, his need for control absolute. To his sons, Lyle and Eric, he was a looming figure, a father who demanded perfection, discipline, and success above all else. For Jose, failure was not an option, and his sons were expected to reflect the same ruthless ambition that had propelled him to the top. Lyle, the older of the two brothers, had inherited some of his father's intense drive. He was handsome and charismatic, often seen wearing polo shirts and loafers, a picture of preppy privilege. But beneath that exterior was a boy struggling to meet the impossible standards set by his father. Lyle's relationship with Jose was fraught with tension. Jose's constant criticism, his sharp words that cut deeper than any physical blow, weighed heavily on his son. Lyle could never be enough, no matter how hard he tried. And as much as he craved his father's approval, he often found himself recoiling from Jose's suffocating grip. Eric, the younger brother, was different, more sensitive, quieter, almost shy in comparison to Lyle. While Lyle pushed back against their father's control in subtle ways, Eric was more passive, retreating inward. He was athletic, with a talent for tennis, but he too struggled to meet Jose's expectations. Every missed point, every perceived failure on the court, was another opportunity for Jose to remind his sons of their inadequacies. The pressure built like a ticking time bomb inside Eric, a deep-seated fear of never being good enough. Jose's dominance extended far beyond the tennis courts or family gatherings. It bled into every aspect of their lives. He made decisions for his sons without consulting them, controlling their future like a master puppeteer pulling the strings. Where they went to school, what they wore, how they behaved, it was all dictated by Jose. And under the weight of his expectations, Lyle and Eric found themselves suffocating, trapped in a gilded cage of their father's making. Kitty, for her part, was caught in the crossfire. She loved her sons, but she was a broken woman, worn down by years of emotional turmoil and her own personal demons. Beneath the perfectly coiffed exterior, Kitty battled anxiety and depression, seeking solace in alcohol and prescription drugs. She was both a victim and a perpetrator in this toxic family dynamic, unable to shield her children from Jose's wrath but too fragile to stand up to him herself. Her presence in the home grew more distant, her ability to protect Lyle and Eric eroded by her own internal struggles. As the years passed, the tension in the Menendez household thickened, suffocating the brothers like a relentless fog. Jose's need for control escalated, and the pressure on Lyle and Eric intensified. The once lavish dinners in their grand dining room became silent affairs, the only sounds the clinking of silverware against fine china and the oppressive weight of unsaid words. The brothers, now young men, lived in a state of quiet terror, their every move scrutinized by their father, their every failure amplified 1,000-fold. To the outside world, the Menendez family continued to project an image of success, smiling at galas, appearing together at tennis matches, the epitome of Beverly Hills royalty. But within the walls of their mansion, a slow decay had begun, and the weight of their secrets was unbearable. Jose's drive, once seen as admirable, now felt monstrous, an unrelenting force that consumed everything in its path. And while Kitty faded into the background, consumed by her own demons, Lyle and Eric were left to bear the brunt of their father's oppressive reign. The cracks in the Menendez family were no longer hidden beneath the surface. They had become fissures, deep and dangerous, waiting for the moment when everything would shatter. And in the summer of 1989, that moment would come, in a way no one could have imagined. The perfect Beverly Hills dream was about to transform into a nightmare. Chapter 2: The Perfect Crime. August 20th, 1989 was a warm summer night in Beverly Hills. The sprawling Menendez mansion sat like a fortress at the top of Elm Drive, its manicured lawns and towering hedges masking the horrors that were about to unfold within. Inside the house, the night seemed as uneventful as any other. Jose and Kitty Menendez, exhausted from their day, were settled in the family room. Jose reclined on the couch, watching TV with his feet up, while Kitty dozed beside him. They had no idea that, at that very moment, their two sons, Lyle and Eric, were making their way back into the house with deadly intent. The air was thick with tension as Lyle and Eric crept through the shadows, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet beneath them. Their hands shook as they gripped the cold steel of the shotguns they had purchased only days before. This was the night it would all end. The years of control, manipulation, and fear they felt under their father's oppressive rule would be silenced with the pull of a trigger. It happened quickly, almost too quickly. Lyle was the first to act. He raised the shotgun, his heart pounding in his chest like a war drum, and aimed it at his father. The blast ripped through the quiet night, the deafening boom of the shotgun shattering the stillness as Jose's body jerked violently before slumping back onto the couch. Blood sprayed across the room, splattering the expensive leather and designer decor. The force of the blast had blown away a part of Jose's head, leaving a gory, unrecognizable mess where his face had been. Kitty awoke in a daze, startled by the noise. Her eyes, heavy with sleep, opened to the nightmare unfolding before her. Panic and confusion flooded her face as she tried to make sense of the horror. She saw her husband lying in a growing pool of blood, saw her sons standing there with the weapons in their hands. Before she could scream, before she could even comprehend what was happening, Eric pulled the trigger. The blast caught Kitty in the leg, sending her crashing to the floor. She tried to crawl away, dragging herself in desperation, but Lyle fired again. This time, the shot hit her square in the arm, and she screamed in agony, her voice echoing through the mansion's grand halls. Eric, trembling and panicked, fired once more, this shot hitting her in the chest. Kitty's body convulsed as her life bled out onto the cold tile floor. But it wasn't over. The brothers, fueled by a mix of adrenaline and fear, unloaded round after round into their parents' bodies, ensuring that there would be no chance of survival. When the silence finally returned, The room looked like a scene out of a macabre horror film. Blood smeared across the walls, fragments of bone and tissue scattered like debris, and the bodies of Jose and Kitty Menendez lying in grotesque stillness. For a moment, the brothers just stood there, their minds reeling with what they had done. Their breaths came in ragged gasps as they stared at the lifeless forms of their parents, the reality of the act slowly seeping in. But there was no time for reflection, no time for guilt. They had a plan, and now they needed to execute it. In a calculated move, Lyle grabbed the phone and dialed 911. His voice, frantic and filled with practiced panic, echoed through the line as he screamed into the receiver, "Someone killed my parents! Oh my God, someone killed my parents!" The dispatcher tried to calm him down, to get more information, but Lyle was too hysterical, too overcome with emotion. Eric's sobs could be heard in the background, his voice barely coherent as he cried out for his parents. To anyone listening, it would seem as if the brothers had just stumbled upon the unimaginable, their parents murdered in cold blood by an unknown assailant. When the Beverly Hills police arrived, the brothers were the picture of grief. They met the officers at the door, their faces pale, their eyes red and swollen from crying. Lyle clung to the officers, shaking with fear, while Eric sat on the curb, his head buried in his hands, trembling uncontrollably. The scene inside the house was a bloodbath, one that immediately sent shockwaves through the responding officers. It wasn't the kind of crime you'd expect in the wealthy enclave of Beverly Hills. The brothers told the police they had been out that evening, going to the movies and later driving around aimlessly. When they returned home, they found their parents murdered. They didn't know who could have done it. They mentioned Jose's ties to the entertainment industry, suggested it might have been a professional hit. After all, who else would want to murder their parents in such a brutal fashion? The initial investigation seemed to support their claim. The crime scene was chaotic, but the sheer savagery of the murders, coupled with the Menendez family's wealth and status, led investigators to believe this could have been a targeted attack, perhaps tied to business dealings, or maybe even a botched robbery. For a while, the police considered multiple angles. Could it have been a mob hit? A disgruntled former business associate of Jose's? Or a robbery gone wrong? The brothers played their roles well. They attended their parents' funeral, surrounded by family and friends who offered their condolences. To the outside world, they were grieving sons, two young men whose lives had been torn apart by tragedy. But as days passed, the cracks in their story began to show. Police investigators, growing suspicious of the brothers' behavior, noticed that Lyle and Eric weren't acting like typical victims of such a horrific crime. Just days after the murders, they began to spend lavishly, using their parents' fortune to indulge in a spree of luxury purchases. Lyle bought a Rolex, a Porsche, and invested in a new business. Eric hired a tennis coach and began competing in expensive tournaments. The detectives' suspicions grew. Their story seemed rehearsed, their grief too theatrical. As investigators delved deeper, they began to piece together a disturbing picture, one that pointed not to an outside assailant, but to the very people who claimed to be victims. For the time being, however, the Menendez brothers remained free, their deception intact. The perfect crime, they believed, was complete. But the walls were closing in, and soon the facade would crack, exposing the horrifying truth beneath. Chapter 3: Suspicion and Wealth. In the days following the brutal murders, the Menendez mansion remained eerily silent, a crime scene now cordoned off and watched by the curious eyes of Beverly Hills. The bloodstains had been cleaned, but the stench of death still lingered, like an invisible specter clinging to the walls. It was as if the house itself had absorbed the terror that had unfolded within it, and now it waited, dark and haunted, for the truth to emerge. For Lyle and Eric Menendez, however, the aftermath of their parents' deaths marked the beginning of a new life. With Jose and Kitty gone, their fortune now belonged to the brothers, and they wasted no time in indulging in their newfound freedom. Grief was an afterthought. Instead, they were consumed by the intoxicating lure of wealth, power, and excess. Lyle, always the more brazen of the two, dove headfirst into the lavish lifestyle that had been denied him under his father's iron rule. Within days of the murders, he strode into a Rolex dealer and purchased a watch that glittered like the promise of a new future. The extravagance didn't stop there. Lyle bought a Porsche, its sleek curves reflecting the sunlight as it purred down the streets of Beverly Hills. He invested in businesses, trying to mimic his father's success but with none of the work ethic or caution. Money seemed endless, and Lyle acted as though it would never run out. He spent with the recklessness of someone who believed they were untouchable. Eric, though quieter, followed his brother's lead. While he didn't seek the same spotlight, he indulged in his own way. He hired a personal tennis coach, training for professional tournaments with a newfound vigor, the courts becoming his sanctuary. The brothers' spending spree caught the attention of those around them, friends, extended family, even casual acquaintances. It wasn't just the amount they spent, but the timing. Their parents had barely been buried, and yet here they were, flaunting their fortune as if celebrating a victory. Whispers began to spread. There was something off about Lyle and Eric, something unsettling in the way they seemed to shrug off the tragedy that had just befallen them. Their spending was just the tip of the iceberg. Their behavior was erratic, their emotions too controlled, too calculated. There was no outpouring of grief, no sleepless nights filled with tears. Instead, they walked with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, as if they were the heirs of a kingdom rather than victims of a horrific crime. Meanwhile, the police investigation, which had initially focused on outside possibilities, a professional hit, a botched robbery, began to shift. Detectives who had seen countless crime scenes couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right with this case. The brutality of the murders, the sheer overkill, suggested something personal. Jose's ties to the entertainment industry may have made him a target, but there was no evidence pointing to outside enemies. No threatening phone calls, no shady business deals that could explain the savage execution of the Menendez parents. Then there was the brothers' alibi. At first glance, it seemed airtight. They had been out that night, they said, going to the movies and driving around afterward. But the details were too perfect, too rehearsed. As investigators dug deeper, inconsistencies began to appear, small at first, but enough to raise eyebrows. The brothers' timeline didn't quite add up, and their odd behavior at the crime scene made detectives pause. Why were they so composed? Why did they seem almost detached from the horror of what had happened? Friends and family, who had once rallied around Lyle and Eric, now found themselves questioning their behavior. Relatives, who had initially grieved alongside the brothers, began to notice their lack of genuine emotion. There were no breakdowns, no moments of raw sorrow. Instead, Lyle and Eric moved through their days with a cold, calculated precision. It was as if they had already moved on, their parents' deaths nothing more than a stepping stone to the wealth they now enjoyed. As the police quietly shifted their focus onto the brothers, Lyle and Eric remained oblivious. They were drunk on their newfound freedom, blinded by the belief that they had gotten away with the perfect crime. Their confidence grew with each passing day, their recklessness escalating. Lyle especially reveled in his power. He flaunted his wealth, making deals and purchases as if daring anyone to question him. Eric, while quieter, found solace in tennis, channeling his anxiety into sport, pretending that the blood on his hands had been washed away with each swing of the racket. But the walls were closing in. Investigators began to build their case, slowly but surely gathering evidence that pointed not to an outside killer, but to the very sons who had played the part of grieving victims so well. They interviewed friends, business associates, even the brothers' tennis coach. Small details, seemingly insignificant, began to coalesce into a larger, more damning picture. One particularly glaring clue came in the form of the brothers' financial records. The investigators obtained access to the accounts that Lyle and Eric had begun tapping into immediately after the murders. The spending was astronomical, hundreds of thousands of dollars in just a matter of weeks. It was as if they had been waiting for this moment, poised to seize their parents' fortune the second the opportunity arose. For detectives, this was more than just suspicious, it was motive. As the weeks dragged on, the brothers' behavior became increasingly erratic. They grew paranoid, sensing that the net was tightening around them. Lyle's once flamboyant displays of wealth began to turn into desperate attempts to maintain control. He started making bizarre business decisions, almost as if trying to distract himself from the growing fear gnawing at the edges of his mind. Eric, on the other hand, retreated further into his shell, his anxiety manifesting in panic attacks that left him gasping for air. The police, now fully convinced that Lyle and Eric were responsible for their parents' murders, prepared to make their move. They had collected enough evidence to cast serious doubt on the brothers' story, and the weight of their suspicions was now impossible to ignore. The once grieving sons were now the prime suspects in what had become one of the most shocking crimes in Beverly Hills history. But Lyle and Eric, still believing they could outrun the consequences, continued their charade. In their minds, they had committed the perfect crime, a crime so meticulously planned that no one would ever suspect them. They had inherited their father's empire, and with it, his ambition, his cunning, and ultimately his downfall. Chapter 4: A Family's Dark Secrets. As the trial began, the courtroom was thick with anticipation, the tension palpable. Lyle and Eric Menendez, sitting side by side, no longer seemed like the carefree, wealthy young men whose parents had been murdered in their Beverly Hills mansion. Their faces were strained, haunted by what they were about to reveal. The world thought it knew the story. Two sons, driven by greed, had coldly executed their parents to inherit a vast fortune. But as their defense unfolded, it became clear that there was another story lurking in the shadows, one of a family shrouded in secrets far more sinister than anyone had imagined. The defense's argument shocked everyone. Lyle and Eric did not deny killing their parents, but they painted a picture of a life so twisted, so filled with terror, that the murders seemed like an act of desperation rather than greed. They had not acted out of a desire for money, they claimed. They had acted out of fear of their father, Jose Menéndez, a man who they said had spent years abusing them in ways too horrific to easily comprehend. Lyle was the first to speak, and as he took the stand, the courtroom grew still. He spoke of a childhood that had been poisoned from the start. Jose Menéndez, he claimed, had been a tyrant behind closed doors, a man who controlled his family with an iron fist, demanding absolute obedience. But Jose's cruelty went beyond discipline or control. Lyle described the emotional and physical abuse that had shaped his early years, detailing how his father's temper would flare at the slightest provocation, leaving him in constant fear of punishment. And then came the more horrifying revelations, the sexual abuse that began when Lyle was a young boy. The details of this abuse were graphic, chilling. Lyle recounted how his father would come to him in the night, his presence a source of terror. Jose, the successful businessman admired by many, was, according to Lyle, a monster in private. The abuse was systematic, cruel, and relentless. It left Lyle broken, trapped in a cycle of shame and fear. His testimony was raw, his voice cracking as he relived the horrors that had haunted him for years. Eric's story was no less horrifying. As his brother described his own experiences, Eric broke down in tears, unable to hold back the emotions he had buried for so long. When it was his turn to speak, his voice shook as he recounted the terror of living under his father's roof. Jose's abuse had not been limited to Lyle. Eric, too, had been a victim. He spoke of the same late-night visits, the same manipulation and control. Jose had groomed them both, warping their understanding of love and family, leaving them to believe that there was no escape. The brothers' claims of abuse stunned the courtroom and ignited a media firestorm. The image of the successful, high-powered Jose Menéndez, a man who had built an empire from nothing, was being torn apart, replaced by the portrait of a predator. As the details of the abuse spread beyond the courthouse, the public's perception of the case began to shift. People who had once seen the Menendez brothers as spoiled, greedy murderers now began to question whether they were, in fact, victims who had been pushed to the edge. Yet the claims of abuse were met with skepticism as well. The prosecution challenged the brothers' narrative, accusing them of fabricating the story to gain sympathy and avoid the consequences of their actions. They pointed out that there were no records, no police reports, no medical evidence to support the claims. While Jose was known to be a controlling father, there had never been any outward signs of the horrors the brothers described. Could these allegations really be true, or were they a calculated defense designed to manipulate the jury? Psychologists were brought in to testify about the long-term effects of abuse, explaining how years of trauma could lead someone to believe they had no way out, no escape. The brothers' attorneys argued that Lyle and Eric had been suffering from what is known as battered child syndrome, a psychological condition similar to what is seen in victims of domestic violence. After years of enduring their father's abuse, the brothers had snapped, their fear overwhelming them. They believed that if they didn't kill their parents, their father would eventually kill them, either through continued abuse or by silencing them forever. The psychological toll of the abuse was evident in the brothers' demeanor throughout the trial. Eric, in particular, appeared emotionally fragile, often breaking down during his testimony. His vulnerability, combined with the graphic descriptions of the abuse, evoked a degree of sympathy from the jury and the public. But the prosecution remained steadfast, insisting that the brothers had planned the murders well in advance, and that their claims of abuse were nothing more than a smokescreen. Outside the courtroom, the media frenzy reached a fever pitch. News outlets debated the brothers' allegations incessantly, with commentators and psychologists weighing in on both sides. Some believed the brothers' story, pointing to their emotional testimonies as proof of their trauma. Others saw the claims as a cynical ploy, designed to distract from the cold hard facts. The Menendez brothers had murdered their parents in cold blood, then gone on a spending spree with the inheritance. The public, too, was divided. Were Lyle and Eric victims, driven to an extreme act of violence by years of torment? Or were they calculating killers, exploiting their claims of abuse to avoid life in prison? The case had become a national obsession, a dark reflection of the complexities of family, privilege, and trauma. As the trial wore on, the courtroom became a stage where the darkest elements of human nature were laid bare. The defense and prosecution waged a war over the brothers' motives, each side presenting its version of the truth. But beneath the legal arguments, one thing became clear. Whatever had driven Lyle and Eric to commit such a brutal act, the damage done to them, and the dysfunction at the heart of the Menendez family, was undeniable. Chapter 5: The Trials. The courtroom was a battlefield. The Menendez brothers, Lyle and Eric, sat side by side, their expressions as impassive as marble, staring down the prosecution as though they were preparing for a final, desperate stand. The air in the room was thick with tension, charged with the weight of what was at stake. Outside, reporters swarmed the courthouse like vultures, eager to feed on every salacious detail, every shocking revelation. The Menendez trial had captivated the nation, and what was once a dark family secret had become a public spectacle, unfolding in front of cameras and splashed across every tabloid headline. From the very beginning, the prosecution wasted no time painting Lyle and Eric as greedy, entitled young men who had grown tired of living under their father's thumb. Jose Menendez, they argued, had been the source of their vast wealth, and the boys, spoiled by their luxurious upbringing, could no longer tolerate his control. They were desperate for independence, but more than that, they were desperate for the fortune they believed was rightfully theirs. The prosecution's theory was simple. The brothers had planned the murder meticulously, a premeditated act designed to rid themselves of their overbearing father and claim his millions. The prosecution's narrative was brutal in its simplicity. There were no complex psychological underpinnings or tales of abuse, just pure cold greed. They laid out the evidence: the guns purchased days before the murders, the spending spree that began almost immediately after their parents' bodies were cold, and the brothers' strange lack of grief. The story was one of avarice and entitlement, the ultimate act of patricide by sons who believed they could have it all. The jury sat in silence as the prosecutor's voice echoed through the courtroom, laying out the damning timeline, the chilling preparation, and the horrific execution of the crime. But then the defense struck back. In a move that had already shocked the nation, Lyle and Eric's attorneys had built their entire case around the brothers' harrowing allegations of abuse. They were not heartless killers, the defense claimed, but broken, terrified boys who had suffered years of unimaginable torment at the hands of their father. The brothers took the stand one by one, their testimonies raw and graphic, pulling back the veil on what had once been hidden behind the pristine walls of their Beverly Hills mansion. Lyle, stoic but visibly haunted, recounted the years of abuse in measured, deliberate tones. His words painted a picture of a father who was far from the successful businessman the world saw, revealing instead a predator who controlled every facet of their lives. Jose, Lyle said, had preyed on both him and his younger brother, using fear, violence, and sexual abuse to dominate them. Eric, breaking down on the stand, sobbed as he described the terror he felt as a child, waiting for the creak of his father's footsteps outside his bedroom door, knowing that no one, not even their mother, would come to save them. The courtroom, packed with spectators and reporters, hung on every word. The details were chilling, horrifying even, and yet there were those who remained skeptical. Was this simply a carefully crafted story designed to manipulate the jury? Could the brothers be exaggerating, or worse, lying, about the abuse to escape punishment? The prosecution was quick to seize on that doubt, challenging the brothers' accounts at every turn, pointing out inconsistencies and the lack of corroborating evidence. There had been no police reports, no documented complaints. Jose's reputation was unblemished, and while those close to the family acknowledged his controlling nature, no one had ever suspected the kind of horror the brothers were now describing. As the trial continued, the nation remained glued to their screens. The media coverage was relentless, turning the courtroom into a theater of drama and suspense. Every moment, every tear, every grim detail was broadcast to a ravenous public. The Menendez brothers became household names, and their faces, once those of grieving sons, were now symbols of something much darker. Tabloids ran wild with speculation, dividing public opinion into two camps: those who believed the brothers were cold-blooded murderers, and those who saw them as victims driven to a desperate act of survival. The trial had become more than just a legal proceeding, it was a cultural phenomenon. It was one of the first times in American history that a courtroom drama had played out so publicly, turning real-life horror into entertainment. The trial became a staple of talk shows, news programs, and late-night debates, with experts, psychologists, and armchair detectives all weighing in on whether the Menendez brothers should be condemned or pitied. As both sides presented their closing arguments, the tension in the courtroom reached a fever pitch. The prosecution, confident in their portrayal of Lyle and Eric as ruthless killers, demanded justice for Jose and Kitty Menendez, whose lives had been violently stolen by their own sons. They painted the brothers' stories of abuse as little more than a desperate fabrication, a last-ditch effort to escape the consequences of their monstrous crime. The defense, however, urged the jury to look beyond the surface, to see the trauma that had driven the brothers to their breaking point. This wasn't about money, they argued. It was about fear, control, and a lifetime of abuse that had left Lyle and Eric believing that murder was their only escape. When the jury finally went into deliberation, the nation held its breath. Days passed as the jurors wrestled with the conflicting narratives, the weight of the brothers' allegations of abuse against the undeniable facts of the crime. In the end, the verdict came, but it was not what anyone expected. The jury was hopelessly deadlocked, two hung juries, one for each brother. The result sent shockwaves through the courtroom and across the country. After months of grueling testimony, heartbreaking confessions, and intense media scrutiny, the trial had ended in a stalemate. For now, Lyle and Eric Menendez would not face conviction, but neither were they free. The hung juries meant that the case was far from over. A retrial loomed on the horizon. Outside the courthouse, the media frenzy continued, with reporters scrambling to make sense of the unexpected turn of events. Public opinion remained divided, with some hailing the hung juries as proof that the brothers' defense had raised reasonable doubt, while others saw it as a failure of the justice system to hold two killers accountable. The Menendez brothers had lived to fight another day, but the specter of their crime, and the dark family secrets that had been laid bare, would continue to haunt the nation. The trial had become a spectacle, but beneath the layers of sensationalism lay the chilling truth. The Menendez brothers were not just defendants, they were the embodiment of a broken family, where love had turned to fear and fear had turned to violence. The world was left to grapple with one harrowing question: what kind of nightmare could drive two sons to murder their parents? Chapter 6: Justice or Injustice? The Final Verdict. The second trial of Lyle and Eric Menendez began under a cloud of anticipation and unease. The courtroom, once again filled with reporters and onlookers, hummed with the weight of what was to come. This time, however, the atmosphere was colder, more clinical. The shocking revelations of the first trial had dulled in the public's memory, replaced by a growing skepticism. The brothers were no longer wide-eyed, broken victims in the eyes of the public. They were suspects whose dark family secrets no longer held the same power to shock. This trial would be different. From the outset, the tone of the courtroom was starkly different from the first. The judge, in a significant blow to the defense, largely dismissed the claims of sexual abuse that had dominated the initial trial. He ruled that while the allegations could be mentioned, they could not take center stage as they had before. This wasn't going to be a trial about whether Lyle and Eric had suffered unimaginable abuse at the hands of their father. This was going to be about murder and whether they had killed their parents for money. The defense team faced a daunting task. Without the emotional weight of the abuse allegations to frame their argument, they were left to tread carefully, trying to keep the focus on the psychological toll the brothers had endured without being able to fully delve into the harrowing details. But the limitations were clear. The judge's ruling had shifted the playing field, and the defense found themselves fighting an uphill battle. The prosecution, seizing the opportunity, sharpened their narrative into a razor-thin accusation of greed. They argued that Lyle and Eric Menendez had never been victims. They had been calculating, entitled young men who saw their parents as obstacles to a fortune. They painted a picture of a family divided not by abuse, but by cold ambition. Jose Menendez, a strict and demanding father, had ruled with an iron fist, but his sons were not traumatized, they were frustrated. Frustrated by their inability to live the lives they wanted, frustrated by their lack of access to their father's wealth. The brothers' lavish spending after the murders became a cornerstone of the prosecution's case. In meticulous detail, the prosecution recounted the tens of thousands of dollars the brothers had spent in the days following the killings. Lyle had purchased a Rolex, a new Porsche, and invested in a restaurant business, all within weeks of his parents' deaths. Eric had taken lavish trips and hired a personal tennis coach. To the prosecution, these weren't the actions of two traumatized boys trying to survive. They were the actions of two young men who had planned the murders for financial gain, reveling in their newfound freedom and wealth. It was this spending spree that became the heart of the prosecution's argument. The brothers had no intention of freeing themselves from a life of terror. They wanted to free themselves from their father's control over his vast fortune. The prosecution argued that the murders had been premeditated, that the brothers had meticulously planned every step, from purchasing the shotguns days before the killings to fabricating the story of a botched robbery. The brutality of the murders, the multiple shotgun blasts, the overkill, was, in their view, proof of their cold-blooded calculation. This was no crime of passion. This was a business transaction executed with deadly precision. As the trial dragged on, the defense did what they could to remind the jury of the abuse that had defined the brothers' lives. They called psychologists to the stand, arguing that years of psychological and emotional torment had left Lyle and Eric with no choice but to lash out in the most extreme way. But without being able to dive into the full details of the abuse, the argument felt muted, a shadow of what it had been during the first trial. The courtroom was a stark contrast to the first trial's emotional outpourings. Where there had once been sobbing and confessions of trauma, now there was a cold, logical dissection of events. The brothers sat quietly, no longer the center of attention, as the prosecution drilled their narrative into the minds of the jury. This was about money, plain and simple. The abuse, if it happened at all, was irrelevant. As the trial neared its conclusion, the air in the courtroom grew tense. The media frenzy outside continued, though the public had become more jaded, more willing to accept the idea that the Menendez brothers were not victims of circumstance, but the masterminds of a horrific crime driven by greed. Talk shows, newspapers, and radio stations buzzed with debate. Had the brothers truly been abused, or was it all an elaborate ruse to gain sympathy? And even if they had been abused, did that justify the brutal, premeditated murder of their parents? When the prosecution delivered their final argument, the message was chilling in its simplicity. The Menendez brothers executed their parents for money. They spent the days after the killings reveling in the wealth they had taken. There is no other explanation. The defense, in their closing statement, pleaded with the jury to see the brothers not as greedy monsters, but as deeply traumatized young men who had been driven to an extreme and desperate act. They asked the jury to look beyond the surface, to consider the years of fear and psychological damage that had led to that fateful night. But when the jury retired to deliberate, there was a sense in the courtroom that the outcome was already decided. This time, there would be no hung jury. No second-guessing. The weight of the brothers' post-murder behavior, the evidence of premeditation, and the lack of convincing proof for the abuse claims had shifted the scales irrevocably. After days of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence was life in prison without the possibility of parole. The brothers sat quietly as the sentence was read, their faces unreadable. The finality of the moment seemed to hang in the air, thick and suffocating. There would be no escape, no more courtrooms or trials, just a lifetime behind bars. Outside the courthouse, the media reaction was swift. Some praised the verdict as a triumph of justice, a clear message that no one, no matter how privileged or wealthy, could get away with murder. Others, however, saw the trial as a miscarriage of justice. They argued that the dismissal of the abuse claims had robbed the brothers of their only true defense, and that while their actions were heinous, they had been born out of years of torment. The debate over whether justice had truly been served would linger in the public consciousness for years to come. But for Lyle and Eric Menendez, the debate was meaningless. They would live out their days in the cold, sterile world of prison, far removed from the opulence of their former lives. Their parents were gone, their wealth gone, their freedom gone, leaving only the haunting question of whether the darkness that had consumed the Menendez family had truly been vanquished, or if it had simply found new forms to take. Chapter 7: Legacy of the Case. The Menendez Brothers case, etched into the annals of American criminal history, is more than just a tragic story of family betrayal. It is a haunting reflection of the dark undercurrents that can lurk behind the closed doors of wealth and privilege. More than 3 decades after Lyle and Eric Menendez brutally murdered their parents, the case continues to loom large in popular culture, shaping the way the media, legal system, and public approach high-profile criminal trials. In many ways, the Menendez case marked the beginning of America's fascination with the courtroom as a stage for real-life horror. It wasn't just the gruesome nature of the crime that captivated the public, but the spectacle surrounding the trial itself. The brothers, who had once been seen as privileged heirs to a fortune, were suddenly exposed as deeply troubled, tormented souls who claimed to have suffered years of abuse. The drama of the courtroom, where the brothers cried, confessed, and laid bare the darkest secrets of their family, turned the trial into a twisted form of entertainment. The media pounced on every detail, turning the trial into one of the first true tabloid court cases, a precursor to the likes of O.J. Simpson and Casey Anthony. News outlets broadcast live from outside the courthouse, and viewers across the nation became armchair detectives, dissecting the brothers' every word, gesture, and tear. The trial blurred the line between justice and spectacle, with some questioning whether Lyle and Eric were getting a fair trial or simply being paraded in front of the cameras for the public's consumption. The brothers' defense, that they had endured years of physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, also sparked a national debate about the use of trauma as a defense for murder. Were the Menendez brothers truly victims, driven to the breaking point by their father's monstrous behavior? Or had they exaggerated, even fabricated their claims to manipulate the system? The question still lingers, with many divided on whether their punishment, life in prison without the possibility of parole, was too severe or not severe enough. Over the years, Lyle and Eric have maintained their claims of abuse, their voices softened but unwavering in prison interviews. Both brothers, now in their 50s, have spent more than half their lives behind bars, their time marked by the stark contrast between the opulence of their former lives and the stark, unforgiving reality of prison. They are housed in separate facilities, both resigned to the cold finality of their sentences, but still clinging to the faint hope of freedom. The brothers' legal teams have attempted multiple appeals over the years, each time presenting new evidence, rehashed arguments, and pleas for mercy. But the courts have been steadfast in their rulings, the original sentence stands. Despite their efforts, Lyle and Eric remain incarcerated, their futures a mirror of the isolation and confinement they claim to have felt in their father's house. Even now, the legal battles continue, with the brothers' advocates pushing for re-examination of their case, particularly in light of modern understandings of trauma and abuse. In popular culture, the Menendez brothers have become emblematic of the dangers of unchecked privilege and the dysfunctional dynamics that can fester within the most outwardly perfect families. They are a chilling reminder that money and power cannot buy happiness or sanity. The image of the two clean-cut, well-dressed young men sitting in court, accused of killing the very people who gave them life, has become an enduring symbol of the dark side of the American dream. Television series, documentaries, and films have continued to mine the Menendez case for its dramatic and horrifying elements. Each retelling brings with it a new perspective, a fresh lens through which to view the brothers' actions, the trial, and its aftermath. From true crime specials to dramatized series, the Menendez brothers remain figures of both fascination and revulsion, their story a stark reminder of the thin line between love and hate, family and foe. Yet, for all the attention and debate the case has generated, there remains an undeniable ambiguity at its core. Were Lyle and Eric truly monsters, driven by greed and entitlement to murder their parents in cold blood? Or were they, as they have long claimed, broken by years of abuse, victims of a father who controlled and tormented them to the point where they believed that killing him was their only escape? The question continues to haunt, dividing those who follow the case. The legacy of the Menendez case also reshaped the way the legal system handles high-profile trials. It introduced the idea that the courtroom could become a stage where the drama of real life played out in front of millions, influencing not only the jury but the court of public opinion. The Menendez brothers case paved the way for trials like that of O.J. Simpson, where media coverage became inseparable from the legal proceedings, and the thirst for spectacle often overshadowed the pursuit of truth. In the end, the Menendez case remains a dark reflection of family dysfunction, privilege, and the lengths to which trauma, real or perceived, can push people. The brothers, once the picture of Beverly Hills wealth, now live out their days in cells, their legacy forever tied to a crime that shocked the world and changed the landscape of American justice. The shadows of their story stretch far beyond the walls of their prison, a chilling reminder that sometimes the most terrifying horrors come not from strangers,